So now to discuss this further, we are joined by a very special guest, Professor Mariam Jamshedi. She is the Associate Professor of Law at the University of Colorado, and she's also the non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute. She's done a lot of work on the legal aspects of national security. Professor Jamshedi, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So now, just a while ago, the U.S. Secretary of War had a press conference after a long time, and his tone was quite, as aggressive as it has been before. Even though, it seems like we may be inching towards some sort of an agreement. I know it's a bit early to predict anything, but the signs are good. And of course, Pakistan is playing a mediator, a role which has been is being appreciated both by Washington and Iran, which is a rarity. So even though the environment is becoming conducive to peace, the Secretary of War comes out with very aggressive statements saying that they can target energy infrastructure of Iran if they don't take a deal. What do you say to that?
I mean, I say to that this is just a continuation of what from the outset has been a wholly illegal and criminal war. So when the war began on February 28th, it had no basis in law and was known as a crime of aggression, one of the most serious violations of international law. Those violations of international law continued throughout the war, and they're continuing vis-a-vis the current ceasefire as well. And should the United States decide to start bombarding energy facilities inside Iran, those would be war crimes too. It's a very obvious and clear war crime to deliberately target civilian infrastructure. And even if this wasn't civilian infrastructure, if you could somehow argue that these energy facilities are what they call dual use, both civilian and valid military objectives, there is actually no military purpose to striking them. As Hegseth's statements make clear, the purpose of striking them is political, to get Iran to basically capitulate to U.S. demands. So even if these energy facilities could be targeted, this targeting would still be illegal because it's not for a military reason.
But if it is illegal, and if these are indeed war crimes, and so much else has happened already in the war, which could be construed as targeting civilian infrastructure, and of course, how can we not mention the killing of 168 young children in a school? So much of such horrendous war crimes have already happened. But even if it's a violation of international law, the problem which you have also highlighted in your writings, Professor, is this enforcement gap where a clear crime is being committed, international law is being violated, but if the country is powerful enough, they get away with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Only that is the way international law has always worked. And in this moment, it's just that much more blatant. The Security Council entertained multiple resolutions that were about Iran's actions within the Strait of Hormuz. So multiple, not just one, more than one resolution was brought before the Security Council condemning Iran's actions within the Strait. Actions that actually, at least in terms of the regulation of shipping and the charging of tolls, you could argue does have some legal basis. What didn't come before the Security Council was any kind of resolution in any way, shape, or form condemning what the United States and Israel had done to Iran. And that's just, one example from this war of the, inconsistency and double standards that are applied, unfortunately, when it comes to powerful actors on the international stage and weaker actors on the international stage. Unfortunately, I don't have a solution beyond the obvious solution that we should treat all states equally. All states should be invested in upholding international law. The erosions that we see happening now in Iran, that we've seen happen across the Middle East as a result of Israel's actions in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Qatar, in Syria, these are eventually going to come and hurt all states. So it's unfortunate that the enforcement isn't happening. States could band together. There are many states in the international legal system that do have heft and weight, like Russia, like China, like Brazil. Of course, Russia has its own international legal problems, but there are a variety of states that could come together to take more meaningful action against the United States and Israel in both formal and informal ways, and they're just not doing it.
And if they're not doing it now, then chances of them doing it again later on are minimal, because the way that we are looking at here at this part of the world, and I'm sure I think a similar perspective is also shared, where you are, that this so-called rules-based order, we've never seen those rules applied equally even before when the order was intact. But now, since this so-called rules-based order is collapsing, we've seen wars of choice being inflicted upon other countries. We've had a genocide with the entire West, either staying silent or even supporting. So with this kind of a, power play, international law has already become a victim. What happens now with, once this war, for example, ends, that rule-based order or the sanctity of international law is already in shreds?
It is in shreds. I mean, my one hope is that, Iran has actually said this themselves in multiple letters that they've submitted to the Security Council and other statements made by Iranian officials, that they're not just fighting this war for themselves, they're fighting it for the region, and they're fighting it for the global south. If Iran is able to stand firm behind its red lines when it comes to these negotiations, if it is in fact able to continue regulating the Hormuz, if it is able, in other words, to basically, win this war as one of, if not the most sanctioned state that has ever existed on the planet against two nuclear powers, one of whom is a global superpower, that to me would be a victory for international law as well. International law still would have been violated quite blatantly, and it's unlikely that the United States will pay reparations or Israel will pay reparations, as they have to under international law, to Iran. But if Iran is still able to secure concessions from those two parties,
and if those...
then from my perspective, it will have at least pushed back and shown that these violations of international law will not succeed. You can maybe bomb a country, but you cannot bomb them into doing what you want. And while that is not the ideal way to uphold the prohibition on the use of force, it at least goes somewhere towards pushing back on states that believe that they can just do whatever they want and get the results that they desire.
This is why what you're saying, the very fact that, this war has not turned out the way that people in Washington or Tel Aviv were actually thinking, this is why I think the US is also now pushing for a deal. Now, when it comes to actual negotiations, we've already had one round in Islamabad, Professor Jamshid, and it is likely, the White House said yesterday, that the next round will also happen in Islamabad. When these negotiations come down to specific demands from both sides, one of the demands which Iran is now making, where I would like your input in terms of the legality of that demand, they are saying that the Strait of Hormuz, now we have a right to put a toll on it. And they've said that that toll could be shared between Iran and Oman, which sit on both sides of the strait. So this demand, do you think it is legal? It can have foundation in international law?
I think an argument can be made that Iran does in fact have the ability to regulate the strait and to charge ships on a non-discriminatory basis for specific services that have been provided to those ships. So, without getting too in the weeds on the law, the real debate here is between the appropriate legal regime for the Strait of Hormuz. And many people argue that that appropriate regime comes from the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And the regime is called transit passage. But that's a treaty. And generally speaking, states that haven't ratified treaties are not parties to treaties and therefore aren't bound by their terms. Now, Iran did sign the UN Convention, but it never ratified it. So it's been 40 years since Iran signed that treaty, but has not ratified it. And one of the main reasons Iran did not ratify that treaty was because it did not agree with the transit passage regime. It, in fact, vigorously objected to it and has continued to vigorously object to it since then. Iran instead accepts a different regime that predates the treaty. That regime is known as innocent passage. And innocent passage does give the coastal states in an international strait more power to regulate passage through that strait. So, for example, they can suspend passage where there are security issues that they are facing. They can regulate the passage for environmental reasons. They can charge ships for special services rendered to those ships as long as they're rendered on a non-discriminatory basis. They cannot just charge for passage. That isn't allowed. But frankly, I think, a lot of the coverage about what Iran is doing is not coming from the Iranians themselves. It's come to hand. The things I have seen that have been coming straight from Iran, and Iran has actually, the parliament in Iran is considering a bill that would actually formalize this regulatory regime within Iranian domestic law. And based on what I've seen about that law, it seems like they're couching the payment as being based in some kind of environmental or security-based rationale. If they do that, then I think they have a very strong argument that what they are doing is legal. If, on the other hand, they say, no, this is just for passage, then that's a problem. But the thing is, the way most of the West, certainly, and frankly, many other states have discussed this, they've discussed it as if the law is clear, and the law clearly prohibits Iran from charging any kind of fee or regulating passage in any kind of way through Hormuz. And that's just not true.
So that means that there is space, there is maneuverability to have some back and forth and find a middle solution that way.
This is not a black and white issue. The way, the U.S. and Israel launching a war on Iran, that was clearly illegal. There is no black and white. That is very much a black and white issue. But this issue of whether or not Iran can regulate the Strait of Hormuz, that is not a black and white issue.
Is this naval blockade that the U.S. is doing against Iran, is that legal?
Well, no, because the war is illegal. The war is illegal. This is a continuation of the war. It's a naval blockade is a clear act of war. It's a clear act of aggression. It also breaks the ceasefire. So even though no guns have been shot, no bombs have been dropped, because this is considered a use of force, an act of war, the ceasefire is actually broken.
I completely agree with you. I was speaking to another professor from a U.S. Naval War College yesterday who was arguing opposite to what you were saying, and I was disagreeing with him. So thank you for being very clear in terms of where the legality or illegality of this blockade stands. Professor,
and if I might add just one quick thing to that, even if the blockade itself was legal, there are requirements in terms of how blockades are supposed to be implemented. And one of the rules regulating naval blockades is that they should not be implemented if the damage to the civilian population is expected to be excessive to any expected military advantage. It is very clear, two things are very clear here. One, the purpose of this blockade is to, again, get Iran to capitulate to the United States' political demands. So it doesn't have a military objective, it has a political objective. So on that basis, it's illegal. But even if it had a military objective, it's also quite clear that the US government is doing this because they want to harm the civilian population. Because they know that if they are basically squeezing Iran such that none of its oil can go out, such that very little can come into the country, that the civilian population will be placed in a very, very desperate situation. And that will put pressure on the Iranian government to, again, do what the United States wants. So for those reasons as well, it's illegal. It's illegal from top to bottom.
Since I have you with me, Professor Jamshedi, I want to use this opportunity to slightly move away from this main topic and ask you something that you've also done a lot of work on, which is, of course, the Palestinian issue. Now, Israel, in this show, I'm also talking a lot about Israel and how things are going badly for Israel in many ways, which not many people would want to acknowledge. But my question to you is that, Israel went into this war and took the US with it to the war with certain kind of objectives. Those objectives have not been achieved, but Israel remains very much the creator and generator of chaos in this region. On genocide, Professor Jamshedi, do you think at any stage in the near future there is any chance of Israel being called out for what they did in any way, through any platform?
Well, the International Court of Justice is currently hearing a very important case that South Africa brought against Israel for the Gaza genocide. I am actually hopeful that the International Court of Justice will conclude that Israel has committed genocide. I mean, at this point, there is just simply too much evidence from too many prominent NGOs as well as UN bodies concluding that Israel has committed genocide in Gaza. It would be a blow to the credibility of the International Court of Justice if it were to conclude otherwise. Now, the downside of this process is that it takes a while. It takes quite a long time for the International Court of Justice to render decisions in these kinds of contentious cases. But it has already rendered several provisional measures decisions in 2024 that have basically found a plausible basis to believe Israel has been committing genocide, that have been helpful in the advocacy of various states, including the state of Palestine. It is not enough, but it has, what has happened in terms of not just the mobilization of states, but the mobilization of civil society since the genocide has happened, I think has made a real difference in terms of Israel's ability to navigate the world as a normal state. And once the International Court of Justice renders its decision, which I'm willing to bet money, a significant amount of money, will find Israel in some form liable for genocide and violating the Genocide Convention, I think that will be something that the state of Israel will be able to overcome. Now, will there be any other consequences beyond a judicial decision for the state of Israel at that point? I don't know. But I do think, what it's doing in Iran, what it's doing in Lebanon, happening in the interim is already really changing the political landscape for Israel, such that, I am actually hopeful that there could be some kind of accountability when it comes to what Israel is doing, at least in Palestine, at some point. I hope in my life.
We all hope that. We all hope that. Professor Mariam Jamshedi, thank you so much. It was a pleasure having you with us. We will take a short break. When we come back, another story which is now having an impact on the people of Pakistan, but not in a good way. After this break.